Hey everyone, we're just about at that time, so we're going to kick this thing off. Welcome to Selenium Academy 201 Best Practices. And we're just going to do a quick intro of the different presenters we have today. My name is Nick Brown. I am the marketing manager for cross-browser testing here at SmartBear, and I'll let Chase do a quick intro as well.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. My name's Chase Cook. I'm a software engineer here at Crossbrowser Testing and work on mostly our automation platform, making sure users are successful using automation on our service.
Great, thanks, Chase. Just going to do a few housekeeping items as well when it comes to SmartBear. We were founded in 2009 in Boston, Massachusetts, and have grown to over 11 global offices encompassing North America, Europe, Asia, and Australia. We have over 6 million developers, testers, and operations professionals from 20,000 plus companies like Google, RBC, and Vineyard Vines. They use our tool on a daily basis. Our company of over 500 employees also provides 5 free tools for the community, including 2 wildly popular open source tools, Swagger and SoapUI. And as you can see here is a quick depiction of all the tools that SmartBear offers. As you can see, we do cover the entire SDLC from planning, design, to testing and monitoring. But for today, we're going to focus on cross-browser testing that you can see right in the center, right above the word test. And from there, I'm going to hand it over to Chase, and he's going to take you through today's presentation, starting with the agenda. I will ask that as we go through this presentation and questions do come about, please direct them to the QA session or section, and we will be sure to get to as many as possible at the end during our live Q&A session.
Awesome. Thanks again, Nick. All right, so let's get started with some Selenium best practices. I'm going to start by briefly going over the agenda, what we're going to talk about today. So we'll start out discussing when to automate and when not to automate. We'll talk about the types of tests you do want to automate with Selenium. We'll go over some best practices for common use cases, common things you would do with Selenium. We'll also go through a live demonstration here on the webinar, and we'll apply some of what we've learned. We'll also talk a little bit about how we can manage test cases as they grow. And as Nick mentioned, we'll have a live Q&A at the very end. If you have any questions, please drop them in the chat window, and we'll get to them there towards the end. So let's get started. So when to automate? Hopefully soon. If you haven't already, hopefully you will after this webinar. But especially if you're just starting out automating, or if you're still in the process of building your application, I would say automate the critical things first, and so that way you can build faster. As you add features in the future, you're going to add test cases, and you'll hopefully see the value of automated testing and continue to build onto it. So I'd say focus on automating the important things. So can a user log into my site? If I have an internet retail company, obviously the shopping cart on my website should be the most battle-tested thing I have. So on and so forth. So automation is a useful tool. Start small, grow big, and you can eventually cover everything you want. The sky's the limit with automation. Things you specifically don't want to automate with Selenium, we'll cover this more in depth. But there are scenarios that are built specifically to prevent automation, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. Also, complexity can make automation difficult. In our own service, for instance, oddly enough, one of the first things we tried to do with automated testing was automating our manual testing interface. From a black box perspective, that's actually really difficult, surprisingly. So some things can make it hard to automate, but for most user scenarios, finding something you can't automate with Selenium is pretty rare. It really comes down to being up to your discretion, how granular you want to get with your test cases and automating the right things. And lastly, manual testing is still important. Automated tests catch what you write them to. They might catch something by chance, something else that you didn't intend them to, but generally speaking, they're testing a user flow or one specific function of your website. Things like user experience or design flaws. Automated testing might not catch that right off the bat, and sometimes that does take a human eye and some a good, decent vision of what your application is supposed to be like. So there are good use cases for automation. There are some use cases where manual testing is still important too. All right, so let's figure out what kind of tests we do want to automate with Selenium. Pretty much any functional aspect of your site, again, can be automated with Selenium. So this can be navigating around your app, validating the content and elements or attributes of elements, testing the state of an application at different points. So I logged in, I went through the login process. Am I logged in on the other side successfully? Is a very, very easy functional test. Test coverage can always be extended to have to a further reach around your application. So you can start with small functional tests like a login form or something like that. But you can build that up into integration tests, which are integrating different features within your system. So you can test common user flows or common scenarios. Shopping for something and putting it in a cart and then checking out your cart would be a pretty wide-end integration test. And then that can be built upon even further to have complete end-to-end tests. And this might not be your goal for automated testing right off the bat, but I've seen a lot of users do it successfully and have a very well-tested functional application because they wrote great end-to-end tests. Visual validation is another big aspect of automation, and Selenium is right there with them, doing a great job at visual validation. So Selenium provides its own internal tools for doing visual checks. It does have and has had built-in screenshots for if you want to take a screenshot of your web page. Some drivers allow you to take full-page screenshots. And now you can even take screenshots of specific elements on your page. So you can do visual validation on your end. And on top of that, Selenium can do anything JavaScript can do. So if you want to retrieve attributes or about your element or where its relative location is on the page, its size, so on and so forth, Selenium can do that. There are a lot of additional tools then built on top of Selenium to make visual testing easier. Our screenshot system is a great example of this in that it can take full-page screenshots of your website and then compare them against different browsers, or even furthermore, regression testing. So taking a full-page screenshot of your application and then comparing it to what it looked like 2 weeks ago. So you can see how those things change over time as you're making changes to your site. Finally, mobile testing is another thing that has been gotten really big recently. Appium is sort of a younger sibling to Selenium, I guess you could say. It's another open source tool that can be used to automate a lot of processes on devices, both Android or iOS, phone or tablet. And when it automates browsers, it uses WebDriver, and therefore it uses a lot of the same protocol that you do with Selenium, with added on features for mobile support like touch and zoom and gestures and stuff like that. So what don't we do with Selenium? So again, there are tools out there like CAPTCHA, which are specifically built to stop tools like Selenium, stop automation. I tend to handle this within the environment, though. It's not something that you should try and use Selenium to get past. Normally, if you're designing your site, maybe where you're going to be performing your tests, your test or your dev environment, maybe not include CAPTCHAs there so that you can perform your automated tests in that way. But it's best not to try and get around any automated or any tools that stop automation like that. Downloading and uploading files is another one I wouldn't necessarily tackle with Selenium. So Selenium is meant to drive browsers. It doesn't try to do a whole lot outside of that. Some web drivers, Chrome springs to mind, they might implement capabilities that allow you to support file upload and download testing. But it wasn't what Selenium was built to do. And as you start switching to another browser like IE or Safari, or specifically if you switch to a mobile device as well, you might find only limited functionality compared to what you had with Chrome and stuff like that. So I wouldn't test downloading and uploading files necessarily. There are other tools that do that very well. Performance and load testing is another example of that. Selenium was built to test functionality, and it's not a very reliable source for performance testing. There are, again, plenty of tools out there that are built for this purpose, and they do a much better job. SmartBear even has ones, and you could check them out. Validating links and response codes. Again, Selenium can do this. Technically speaking, you could build a Selenium test that crawled your website, but it would probably be a waste of time as far as trying to use Selenium to do that. There are tools that do those things and do them very well. Video streaming is one more case. So Selenium is limited in what it can do with streams, video streams on an application. It could verify that the element was there, the HTML5 video element. It could tell you that the stream was playing even, but it couldn't validate the content of that stream. And that's just like I was talking about a moment ago. Trying to automate manual testing is hard because there's that stream there. And again, user experience, it tends to require human eyes and that original vision for what you wanted your site to look like. And so if there are automated tools to do that, Selenium probably isn't the one for it. All of these could be considered edge cases that you might encounter when you're testing your application. And in all cases that Selenium can't do it, there are usually better options, and that's typically just not what Selenium was built to do. All right, let's start covering some common use cases. So consistently finding elements on a page. I think John Reese went over this a little bit in our last webinar, and I'm going to go into it even more in depth because finding elements on a page is a challenge. And it's not necessarily finding that element. It's finding an element and then switching from one platform to another or from one browser to another and still consistently finding that element so that you don't lead to false negatives. We'll discuss how we can do that. Waiting for events to occur. So web pages and really browsers in general are sort of on an event-based model, I guess you could say. We might wait for a page load to occur, or we might wait for some JavaScript to execute or some CSS changes to happen. And Selenium has built-in ways to do this, and we'll learn how we can use them to best effect. And this last one differs a little bit from the first two, but I think it's a really, really good one to talk about. And I'm here to talk about it. And it uses the first two topics, but treating web pages as objects. And that helps you first encapsulate those first two topics into one entity, but it also helps you manage your test cases further down the road so that you can reuse code and so on and so forth. So let's get into looking at each one of these. So we'll start with finding elements on a web page. So there are preferred ways to do it. There's actually plenty of ways to do it. I like to use the by class. And as you learn to use Selenium, you'll see lots of examples using by. There are convenience methods in each of the Selenium language bindings, like find an element by an ID or find element by name. But these all use the same underlying mechanism called by, which is commonly used in Selenium 3, and it's going to continue to be used in Selenium 4 because it adheres closer to that W3C protocol. It provides basically an interface for finding elements on the page. It does this using two things, one called a locator strategy, and then a locator itself. W3C has actually given us 5 different options for locator strategies. Those are CSS selector, link text, so anchor tags on your page, partial link text. So if I had a link that said hello Chase, I could say partial link text would be hello, and it would also work for hello John. Tag name is another selector, and so is XPath. The list is actually shorter than it used to be. So if you've used Selenium in the past, you might remember from the older days when we used JSON wire protocol as the underlying protocol for Selenium. It would have literally find element by ID and find element by name. But in the W3C protocol, that doesn't exist. It adheres closer to query selector and query selector all, those specific JavaScript functions. And the reason for that is because WebDriver was having to implement the same logic that browsers would often have to for searching for elements, and it just made no sense. So we're going to look at using examples of these here in a moment. All right, a little bit deeper on the by class. Again, it's a mechanism for finding elements on a page. It takes, as parameters, it'll take an XPath. Hopefully you can see my mouse moving. It'll take a locator strategy, I'm sorry, in which case this is XPath, and that's that constant I'm talking about. It also takes a string, which is going to represent that actual value of that locator. So this would be the literal XPath that you could find that element in the browser with. And it could be a string. It could also be a pattern. Some language bindings may implement by slightly different, but generally speaking, it should be about that. And it doesn't differ too much. But generally, locators are tough because they can change. You want to find a string that will always match the element you intend to. And so on desktops, this might not change dramatically from browser to browser, but it can definitely change when you switch over to, say, a mobile device. I know for a fact our marketing site, on a mobile device, the DOM of the page structurally changes, and therefore some CSS selectors wouldn't necessarily work. Using IDs and names are typically the best way of finding those elements, and then IDs and names can be converted to CSS selectors very easy. And that will make it very easy for you to, I want to switch to a mobile device, and I still want my submit button locator to work. So you can continue to do that. But once you've found an element, you actually need to do something with it. And we'll actually cover this in depth when we get to the code discussion. But first I want to cover timing, a little bit about timing. And that has to do with our next best practice is trying to use waits. So waiting for things to happen. Waiting is having your automated test execution stop for a certain period of time before continuing to the next step. Now, already it's not necessarily time. It's really generally trying to wait for a specific condition to be true. And Selenium does a really great job of this. It provides two different kinds of waits. So we'll start with implicit waits. They poll the DOM for a certain amount of time, waiting to try and find an element. They're defined, their scope is a little more global than the second one we'll talk about. But it tells the WebDriver on the other end to wait up to a certain amount of time before giving up on finding an element. So if I say, find this submit button, and I have an implicit wait that I've defined as being 20 seconds long, WebDriver will look for that submit button for up to 20 seconds. And if it doesn't find it, it'll throw me a timeout exception saying, I couldn't find that element. Explicit waits, on the other hand, are a little different in that they are expecting specific conditions to occur before continuing the script execution. Implicit wait was doing that too, but you have a little more freedom to specify the condition you want with explicit waits. And they also explicit waits are on a per by use basis. So let's actually look at this code sample. So I've defined this WebDriver wait and named it wait. I've handed it to my driver, and I've given it the number 10. That 10 right there represents the number of seconds I'm willing to wait for this condition to be evaluated. Then I'm actually going to go start looking for an element, and I'll wait until this expected condition is true. So our condition here is this element, this ID, to be clickable. So we're going to go try and find that element. I'm going to wait for it to be clickable. And at the longest, I'm going to wait 10 seconds for that to happen. So you can kind of see how this is far more dynamic, even than implicit waits. And then on top of that, far more dynamic than something like a sleep in your script, because you're waiting just long enough to carry on forward in your tests, and not waiting too much longer, and also not sleeping for too small an amount of time. There are lots of expected conditions. If you want to check out the list, Selenium HQ has it out there. Element to be selected, visibility of, presence of an element in the DOM somewhere. You can even expect things about the URL or the title. The list is very exhaustive. And so you have a lot of options for expected conditions. It is recommended by Selenium not to mix weights. So if you mix an implicit weight and an explicit weight in the same test session, you'll get some unexpected results. And they are definitely unexpected. Weight in general improves the success rate of your tests. And that's true running locally. It's even more so true when you move to a grid. The reason for that is just because as soon as things start leaving your box, your machine, latency becomes a factor. So the network becomes involved, and you're talking to remote machines running things in high parallelism, and that creates a lot of variables. And so weights, dynamic weights especially, become very useful and will make your tests a lot more resilient. I would not recommend sleeps necessarily for testing, at least not with Selenium. Sleeps are, if you're not familiar, are not limited to Selenium. They're just a general tool when developing software. But sleeps just pause execution on the current thread for a defined amount of time. You can do it wherever you want to. So it's really easy to say, hey, I want to sleep for 3 seconds waiting for this page to finish loading. But generally speaking, web pages don't operate on defined amounts of time. So that having that variability can throw off tests with sleeps. And I would tend to recommend waits over sleeps in general. All right, so let's talk a little bit about objects. Objects are a very common construct in programming. We use them all the time. And it's based off real-world ideas. In the real world, we treat things as objects. Those objects have attributes, and then they have some function. And we can use these same objects to encapsulate data relevant to that object, as well as the behavior we want that object to exhibit. And a great example of this could be in a basic login form. A login form has some data relevant to the task it's meant to perform, and you can see that over here. We have the title of a page. We have the locators for the elements on that page, the username, password, and submit button. And then we also have the data we'd like to enter into those fields. So we can clearly see a web page on its own has data. And on top of that, it also has some function, some behavior that we'd like it to implement. A login page specifically should very well be able to log in. And so we've actually defined a login function, and it performs a login process. So we fit all of the data and the logic behind it for a login page into one script that we can then use to actually fill out this login form. All of this was defined in an object rather than along with the rest of my test case. And we can start small like this and add more to our object as we deem it necessary. But this really lays the groundwork for how we'll test our login page moving forward. It's a common function, logging into our login form, so we'll probably use it throughout the rest of our test cases. And that means modularizing it like this helps us further down the road and promotes more code reuse. Let's keep talking about page object model a minute more. So why was this helpful? Well, page object model, like I said, tends to promote code reuse. Our login form will likely be used with all of our test cases. So we'll log in and test one section of our app and another section of our app later, but we're going to need to log in both times. And so modularizing it like that definitely helps us. And in both cases, we simply need to import our login form class, and then call its login function. Really slims it down to just 2 lines of code instead of having to copy and paste the same logic in multiple places. On top of that, when web page changes, and your web pages probably will change over time, you don't need to change every single line of code that you've copied around. You only need to change that one page object corresponding with that page. So in our case, if the selectors for our login form changed, we'd only need to change that one specific function where we log in rather than having to change it elsewhere in our app, in our test cases. Everything else should just continue to work the way it currently does. So should you always use page object model? I'd say not necessarily. Page object model could be slightly more time consuming on the front end. But if you're only trying to set up a few automated tests, POM might not be necessary. And it may not be the style you intend to use in the long run. But as your test coverage grows, and it probably should, page object model can make it much easier to make tests manageable and easy to navigate. It's also a lot easier to reason about. So if someone else is looking at your test cases and looking to implement on them or add to them, or if I'm looking at my own test cases 2 years from now and I'd like to reason about them, page object model makes it easier to jump around and understand what's going on. All right, so let's start applying what we've learned. We've covered finding and verifying page elements. We've taken a look at weights. Those are pretty cool. And we've talked a little bit about using the page object model. I'd like to jump into a demonstration actually show you some of these things. So I have made a repo similar to how John Reese did with the last 101 if you were there. It's at that location, and hopefully Nick can drop it in the chat for you. So if you want to get in there, follow along, look at the code, try and run it yourself, you're more than welcome to, and I'd encourage that. My examples use Python 3.7. I used the Selenium language bindings for Python, and I also posted the link for Chrome driver into the repo as well. You'll need it in order to run some of these test cases. Very cool. So let's jump out and look at some code.
Hey, Jason, I can just jump in. So it doesn't look like the chat function's working, but I will be sure to send out that link in the recap email.
Sounds good. Yeah, that's fine too. Hopefully, my walkthrough of it will be pretty explanatory for the time being. You guys can feel free to look at it later. It'll definitely be there. All right. So I first wanted to cover an example of looking for elements. And we spoke a little bit about by earlier in the presentation. Let's actually take a look at that. So say I'm at our app, and I would like to automate the process of logging into this page. We'll get rid of my credentials because they're not important right now. And let's see how we can find locators for these elements. We'll first need to obviously fill out the email address, the password, and then we'll need to click this button. And if I just right-click and inspect, I can see my username field obviously has a name attribute, an ID attribute. This is actually a pretty interesting one, and I'll talk about it in a minute because I'm actually going to use it. But I'll explain that more as well. This same ID and name can be mapped to Selenium functions. So if we look at our script, if you started with John Reese's email or John Reese's webinar a couple weeks ago, this might look a little bit more complicated. I'm not going to spend time trying to explain Chrome driver or driver.get. I'm kind of assuming you already know those things. But I do want to talk about how I'm finding these elements. So I want to find the email input form, and I'm doing driver.find element, and I'm passing it a by object along with that constant. So I'm actually using the ID field to find this element on the page. So let's see what that looks like. So I'm going to run this. I went ahead and put a little pause in here so that we can kind of run this as we go, and I can explain it a little bit. But I should expect it to start a Chrome, navigate to our login form, and stop. Okay, so the reason I wanted to do this as I went is because throughout this, I'm actually printing out the objects I'm getting back, so you can see what they look like from Selenium's point of view. And objects have a lot of properties, or these elements have a lot of properties that you can use. You can get attributes about this element. You can get their relative location on the page, their size. You can take screenshots of them as PNG format. Specifically, I'm about to use send keys, so on and so forth. And then elements have methods of their own, so you can find elements relative to other elements. I won't show that here, but that is an option. If I press enter here, we should actually see execution continue. I should enter something into the email address form, and then I printed out what I got back for the password field. Password field, I just used, I think it's a name attribute. So if we look at this password field, it should have an attribute name of password. And it does. So let's try using that, and we'll send a password to that element, which worked great. And then finally, this one is the submit button. Nothing really new happening there. It's just, this is it capturing the submit button here, and it's going to use that to click on that submit button and log in. Now, something I did want to talk about was how I actually got to this submit button, because that is a little bit more interesting than just using an ID or a name. This one is also just, I believe, just as resilient as an ID or a name, and it's a CSS selector. But this is a pattern that we've actually used in our app for our own Selenium testing. If I go and inspect this element right here, we'll see it has an ID of login button. I could have used that, but I chose to use this one. This is actually a custom element that we specified in our DOM, because there are times where the front end needs to use ID and our testers need to use ID for different purposes, and so on and so forth. So we made our own element specifically for Selenium testers to, for our Selenium testers to go and actually automate this process when they need to, using this data SEID field. And it's going to be the only element on that page that has that field with that value. So I'm pretty much almost assured that that is going to be as unique as these other elements, even when I flip over and start testing on some other platform. So I thought that was interesting, and I wanted to share that with you. All right, so we did go through and automate the login process. And I noticed one thing there at the end. It was kind of hard to see, but it actually stopped execution before it made it to our app. It went through the login process. It hit the submit button, but it didn't wait for anything else to happen. It just stopped. So let's try adding some weights to it. This is going to be the exact same script. It's not going to change very much, but there is this added piece down here. So I want to create this weight object, this web driver weight. It's also going to take that same driver I've been using, and I'm going to pass it a value of 10 seconds. It should never take more than 10 seconds to log into our page, so I feel pretty safe about that one. And remember, Selenium isn't going to wait for 10 seconds. It's going to wait up to 10 seconds. So it'll probably finish much faster. And specifically, we're going to look for an element on the page. I'm using that CSS class that CSS tag that we created earlier to look for something called live test URL, and we'll see what that is in a moment. So let's try this same thing. So with a weight in it. So we went through our login process. I'm not waiting too much longer. We're going to hit that submit button, and we should land on our live testing page. Now, again, this URL, the element that I was waiting for is actually this URL bar. So if we go and look at that, we should see, again, we have that data SEID tag that specifies live test URL. My Selenium test waited until it found that. It didn't take 10 seconds, and then it knew to stop execution after that. Press continue, it should stop the test. So pretty cool technique in which you're not sleeping, you're only waiting just as long as you have to, but you are waiting the entire time you need to. And that makes your tests far more resilient and successful in the long run, especially when you flip over and start running tests on a grid, either locally or using a service like cross-browser testing. All right, so we talked a little bit about weights, and we did talk about finding elements on a page. Let's spend a little bit of time looking at how we could take this same stuff and rather than copy it from this script and then put it in this script and then put it in every place I need to log into the app, let's take that same pattern and turn it into an object. So I definitely see we have some attributes, some things that are going to stay constant between all of these. And then we have some behavior. We want to enter the email, then enter the password, and click submit. So we can define our own login form class. So I've defined this login form class. It has a title, an email address, a password. You probably shouldn't put these in plain text in your script. I would strongly advise against it, but for the purposes of this example, I didn't really care. And this account can't really do anything anyways. So didn't bother me too much if you guys got your hands on it. I am also specifying locators up here. And again, that's because if any of these locators change, say I want to test a different account, or say I want to feed this login form different accounts to process. If I want to do some data-driven testing or something like that, I can easily do that, and I can change this one spot, and that'll affect all of my test cases. I'm also defining a login function here. So this is where some of the function of this object comes from. And it's basically just automating that login process the exact same. The advantages of doing it this way are that I can now go over to, say, a main function, a place where all of my test cases live, where I test live testing and test Selenium. All I need to do is import my login form and then choose to use it when I need to. So when I test live testing or I'm testing Selenium, I'm going to have completely different sessions. I'm going to be testing completely different things. But in both cases, I need to log in, and I'm doing that. So let's try running this, and we'll see it actually execute both cases. And in both cases, it'll log in differently. So we ran our live testing form. We filled out a URL. I've got to sleep in there for 5 seconds just for example purposes. But then we can go switch over and start testing Selenium. It automatically fills that login process for me, saved me a whole bunch of code to write in the long run, and it made it make a little bit more sense, I think. And hopefully you agree with that. So it'll quit this here in 5 seconds as well. And furthermore, I could come down here and write another function that tests screenshots and continue using that login form. Furthermore, I could even, this would be a really good spot to create a live testing class. And that would be for our live testing page and our Selenium testing page. And each one of those objects could contain different functional aspects of that page, as well as the data that coincides with that page, so that you're not having to write code over and over and over again. So hopefully that makes sense. And hopefully as you continue to build your tests, you can adapt some of this and prevent yourself from having to write a lot of unnecessary and copied code. Awesome. Well, that's all I have for the demonstration. I wanted to, maybe we can jump back over here to the slideshow. And I think now would be a good time to kind of talk Q&A or any, anything that's come in on the chat over course of this and see if you guys have any questions.
Great. Thanks, Chase. Right before we start the Q&A session, I'm just going to launch 2 quick poll questions, if you don't mind answering these quickly, and then we will move on to the Q&A session. And Chase, as well as this is running, I don't know if you want to start with some of the questions that came in through the QA chat bubble.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'll jump on this real quick.
All right, great.
Okay, so we got Selenium versus JUnit. What criteria or guidelines do you use to decide when to use which test tool? That is completely up to you. So Selenium and JUnit are 2 different things that can kind of be used together, and I have seen them used together. So JUnit can be used to drive Selenium tests, and Selenium tests can be written in Java without using JUnit at all. So it really comes down to what meets your criteria as far as keeping your tests organized, easy to read, easy to build on top of, and really easy to run. Another aspect that you might think about with JUnit is how easy is it to parallelize those things. So if I want to run more than one test at a time, how hard is that to do in JUnit or any framework that you pick? So those are my thoughts on that.
Great. And I'm just going to end this poll and then launch the last one. Thank you for all that responded. And this one is more geared towards if you'd like to be followed up with one of our solutions advisors, just for a more in-depth walkthrough of cross-browser testing. You can just select yes here and be sure to get you in touch with the correct people.
Awesome. So we had another question. Why we can't automate video streaming. And maybe it's just for my own clarification's sake. So like I said, you can automate things about video streams. As far as I'm aware, you can. I've used JavaScript and Selenium to test whether a video is playing, whether a video is present on the site. But you can't necessarily determine things about that video stream, as in the data that is actually coming in, at least as far as I know. And like I said, you can validate links and response codes with Selenium, but there are tools out there that crawl websites and do a very good job of finding and validating response codes for you without having to navigate to all those pages using Selenium. I just think it would be a better use of time to use those tools that are designed to do that. In planning scope, is there a rule of thumb for sizing automation development? Should automation sizing equal 50% of your total dev time? I don't know about 50%. I don't know what the percentage should be. I think that kind of varies depending on your use case. But like I said, it also depends on how much automation you already have and where you're starting out. So are you still building your application? Is it an application that's been around for some time and you're just starting with automation? Obviously, you want to continue building on your application and you want to test the things that are critical first. And you'll always have time. You'll always be able to build on those automated test cases and expand your test coverage to those things further. So I wouldn't give you an exact percentage. I would say it definitely varies from use case to use case. Can Selenium verify data in a database? That's a great question. So Selenium doesn't, but your scripts can. Now, the question might be more, do you want to? So it depends on how you're using Selenium. Is it black box versus white box? That is to say, am I using this as a user with no knowledge of what's going on the back end, in which case you probably wouldn't want to talk to a database. Or is it white box where I'm testing something very complex, and I need to actually be able to validate things in the database with input I just entered in my Selenium test, in which case you potentially could. Those things can also change when you start going and using remote services, so be wary of that. But you absolutely have access to whatever you want within your scripts. So if you need to check something in a database, you can. You can find, another question was, can we find any element on the page without using by? Yes, you can. There are little convenience methods called find element by ID, find element by name. They're, they all use by underneath, and they're not quite as flexible when you're changing your scripts. You have to go change the method name and so on and so forth. But really, they're convenience methods, and they're helpful for that too. So you can absolutely do that. Is implicit weight applied for all web elements on the page and explicit for only one element at a time? So let's think about that for a second. So if I wanted to implicitly weight at the top of my script, I could say driver.implicitly weight. I should not code live. But I could implicitly wait for 10 seconds. And now every time I go and find this element or this element down here, it will wait up to 10 seconds. Now with my other example, which is using explicitly wait, in this case, it does work for just one element. But that isn't necessarily to say I couldn't also do another element, so say URL bar 2 equals wait dot until, and still continue using that same WebDriver wait. And I could provide another expected condition here if I wanted to. So I don't foresee any problem with using this style. But that's a good question. Can you go over again what the difference between implicit and explicit waits? Hopefully that did it, but very briefly, implicit wait would wait for up to 10 seconds for this element, up to 10 seconds for this element, up to 10 seconds for this element, the same every time, unless I redefine that somewhere. Whereas explicit wait uses not necessarily time. Time is a factor. It will wait up to 10 seconds, but you define what the expected condition is supposed to be. And in a minute, I might actually go into Chrome and I'll show you guys the full list. There is a huge list of expected conditions you can use. I'm using a presence of an element being there, but you can also validate things about the URL, so that kind of thing. So I say explicit waits are a little bit more dynamic, a little bit more customizable. Implicit waits kind of blanket cover a lot of things.
Hey, Chase, why don't we pick a few more? I know everyone probably has a busy schedule, so just want to make sure we're cognizant of everyone's time. One come up in the QA section that I thought would be beneficial for this group to understand is what's the benefit of using Selenium with cross-browser testing?
Oh, that's a great question. So Selenium's a powerful tool on its own, and as you could see, I was running a simple Chrome test here. But say I wanted to expand that to not just run one test on Chrome on my Mac. Say I wanted to test Chrome and a Safari. I could manage that on my Mac. But say I need to test Edge All right, now I can't I can't do that on my Mac. Actually, they might be coming out with Edge for Mac, but IE would definitely be. There's no way I can't test IE on my Mac. So, say I want to test if I need to do that, if I need to validate things on IE, and that's a common thing. Cross-browser testing would be the place I'd want to send my test. So I could easily change just this one line of code. We have tons of examples of how to do that in our own documentation, and I could be running on IE on cross-browser testing on the latest Windows 10. Furthermore, like I said, I was just running one Chrome or one Mac. Say I wanted to scale that to 10 parallel tests or 25 or 50 or 100. Well, that's pretty difficult to manage on my Mac. 100 would not be possible on my Mac. 25 might not be possible on my Mac. Furthermore, I could easily do that with cross-browser testing because those things are expandable. So I can test different platforms, different browsers, and I can test them with a very high volume to get my tests executed quicker. So hopefully that makes sense. Let's see. Any other questions? Another one on database validation. See a lot of questions about frameworks. Honestly, I think John Reese brought this up, and I thought it was a great point. I think if you're just getting started, it's super simple to just write straight up Selenium, just using the Selenium language bindings and getting in there and playing around, writing some valid test cases. This is just fine, honestly. With a little bit of error handling, you could start to make actual test cases out of these. And this was not using any test framework. So you can go in there without a test framework specifically. But then once you do get to that point where you want to organize your test suites a little bit better, you're running more and more tests and you need to be able to manage those things. And again, if you want to be able to run things with high parallel volume, definitely consider those things if you do decide to start looking at a framework, because they can be important factors later, and a test framework can actually hurt you on some of those factors. So hopefully answers that question.
So Chase, why don't we pick one more and then we can wrap up. And for any questions that we don't get to, you can reach out to nicholas.brown@smartbear.com. And I'll be sure to work with Chase if it's a technical question and I don't know the answer to it. I'll be sure to get back to you with that answer as soon as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, I'll just pull one more test out of the hat, or one question out of the hat. Can you integrate Selenium with BDD? That's a great question, and you absolutely can. I've written a lot using behavioral-driven development with Selenium. And Cucumber is a great framework. It is a SmartBear product. Now you can use Cucumber, and then there's lots of tools that work in accordance with BDD to kind of turn your Selenium tests into plain text, almost plain text English. And so that's an awesome use case for BDD, and a great use case for Selenium as well. And it also helps make your tests understandable for you, but also shareholders that might also be in your organization. So that's a good one. And you can use lots of SmartBear products to do it too. So.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Chase, for taking us through this presentation today. Hopefully you were able to learn some best practices when it comes to working with Selenium and therefore cross-browser testing. I want to thank everyone that attended today's webinar. You can be on the lookout for a webinar or an email sent out with the recording of the webinar. And as I mentioned, if there are any questions that do come about, please reach out to nicholas.brown@smartbear.com and I'll get back to you as soon as possible. All right, guys, have a great day. Thanks.